We can view the abduction of Nicolas Maduro as part of the current course pursued by the Trump administration, which openly undermines sovereignty and the balance of power in international politics. This all smacks of a world order that existed even before the League of Nations. The emperors of the major European nations would gather at each other's residences and deliberate on how they could effectively govern Europe, indeed the entire world. I am powerful, and that is simply what I desire. And if I possess such strength, then I inherently have the authority and the right to proceed with it. Sovereignty is the cornerstone of all order in international relations. It's a vaccine against chaos, against a constant war of all against all. Law does not abolish force, but it makes force a very expensive instrument of foreign policy.
Hello everyone, this is the podcast Man Has the Right. It's hosted by me, Mariana Taracheshnikova, and by me, Natalia Jampolatova. Hello.
The beginning of 2026 was marked by a major international scandal. On January 3rd, U.S. Special Forces invaded Venezuela, capturing the country's president, Nicolas Maduro, his wife, Cilia Flores, and transporting them to the United States of America. They will now be tried there, specifically for narco-terrorism and conspiracy to import cocaine. American President Donald Trump declared that he would not stop there. He had already threatened Colombian President Gustavo Petro with a similar turn of events, and he began even more insistently to repeat that Greenland should come under American control.
Is it even possible to arrest a sitting leader of a foreign state in their own country? Under what conditions would this not be considered kidnapping? If the US bombs Caracas and removes Maduro, is Russia then entitled to act similarly in its own interests? We will be discussing this topic with the guest of today's podcast episode. He is a doctor of political science, a methodologist at the Skills Institute, and a lecturer at the Free University, Dmitry Zavyalov. But first, it's good to understand what state sovereignty is and why, after the Maduro story, everyone suddenly started talking about Trump infringing on the sacred principle of world order.
Sovereignty means that a state itself controls its own territory and exercises authority within its own borders, and other states cannot come in by force and, so to speak, impose their own order as they see fit. This is a basic guarantee for security in the world. If it's undermined, any strong power can forcefully enter the territory of the weak and change the government, borders, people's destinies, doing whatever they please at their own discretion. Sovereignty, its very definition, is encoded within the word itself. That is, it's supra and reign, meaning it is the highest form of authority that exists. The historical ideas of sovereignty as the foundation of the European order in international relations are usually associated with the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, when the states involved in that war decided they would determine their own internal structure, and it was very important that they themselves would determine the faith within their borders. And they understood that external imposition, how to organize life within their own borders, what religious faith to embrace. All of this inevitably leads to an unending war, one that could go on for 30 years or 40 years or simply without end. It's important to say that this kind of sovereignty and the belief in such sovereignty isn't some sort of romantic notion. It's not a cult that we absolutely must have a state or that a state is something inherently given with its own sovereignty. I would say that it's a practical rule against chaos in international relations, against chaos in international politics.
It is a prohibition of force that protects the weak in international politics. And in the UN Charter, it is directly enshrined sovereignty. In Article 2, Paragraph 4, it is clearly stated in black and white that threats or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state are prohibited. Therefore, sovereignty is the cornerstone of the entire international order, a vaccine against chaos, against some constant war of all against all.
And when we acknowledge the sovereignty of individual nations and the systems of governance in these countries as something that we cannot simply come and interfere with, then we must, by extension, also acknowledge the forms of government within that particular country. If a head of state is elected by its people, we cannot arrive, abduct, seize, and then transport them to some other nation. For ordinary citizens, what this means is that there is no risk of a chain reaction within international relations and that we are able to live in a somewhat predictable world.
It's quite clear that the state operates independently. It's also clear that it possesses its own sovereignty and it has a leader, whether he was selected by the people or not, but one way or another he certainly does exist, and they themselves somehow establish their own rules. But if neighbors see, hypothetically speaking, that in this particular state they are torturing kittens or perhaps children or burning witches, then why not intervene and offer assistance to these unfortunate, clearly oppressed people?
Good question. And I am, in fact, on the same page as you.
I absolutely agree that if somewhere people start torturing kittens, or if somewhere they begin to kill people, I don't know, based on some particular characteristic and so forth, if some form of genocide is taking place, then the international community, and here I wish to underscore the distinction of the international community from the will of one particular state that takes on the responsibility of being a policeman in global politics. If we have an international community, we have the United Nations Security Council, and according to the principle in English, it's called responsibility to protect. In Russian, it can be translated as the international community's responsibility to protect human rights and people worldwide.
So if we have a mandate from the United Nations Security Council, we can come and try to protect citizens in any given country.
The problem is that, as an idea, this entire concept of responsibility to protect looks quite good. When you explain it to someone, people immediately understand and begin to support it. But when it comes to practice, it turns out that the international community trying to protect kittens in some country from its dictator, while that dictator starts a civil war, if this is done headlong, just coming to close the airspace over, say, a hypothetical Libya, for example, then ultimately post-conflict management in that country will require very prolonged support from the international community once again. When we move from the theory of the responsibility to protect people to practice after such attacks, it can be said that these countries are left with political vacuum gaps, and the international community must, I believe, it must remain in these countries supporting their democratization. And before Maduro, there was the case of Panama, where a national leader had also declared himself the leader of the nation. After America also took him back to its own country, Panama experienced a significant economic downturn. A serious drug problem emerged there after this operation. And when the citizens of Panama were asked, many would even say that life, it seemed, was somehow better under our dictator than in a democracy that is neither supported nor protected and which simply appeared all on its own. And so, regarding my moral position, I believe that if we begin to protect kittens in a certain country, then we need to do it competently and for a long time, by protecting these kittens all the way to the end and by supporting democracy and human rights in those kinds of nations.
You just cited the capture of Manuel Noriega in Panama in 1989 by the Americans as an example. So theoretically, it's possible to come and remove some dictator with joint international forces with the support of the UN Security Council and other members of the United Nations. And then this won't be considered some kind of abduction, crude interference in the sovereignty of a specific country.
We have three ways if we want to come and resolve something in the territory of another state without its consent. We can proceed under the mandate of the UN Security Council. When the UN Security Council, absolutely everyone adopts a resolution, then it is mandatory for implementation. There are complications, again, due to the fact that we have 5 countries with veto power who, in their own regions, if their interests are affected, begin to impose their veto. So that's one option, to go through the UN Security Council. The second option is simply to declare self-defense. And this, perhaps, is precisely what Trump is currently doing in the situation concerning Maduro. He claims that the United States of America is under attack from cartels, specifically those cartels that are being led by Nicolas Maduro, and they consequently are bringing illegal immigrants along with their criminal activities into the United States of America. And consequently, an attack is happening on the sovereignty of the United States. And in self-defense, we could remove Maduro or invade Venezuela itself and do anything. That is, we have a UN Security Council mandate, a self-defense situation, or if it's with the consent of the state itself, which allows another state to come and take one of its citizens, even if, for example, it was a president, I don't know, or someone else like that. No?
You are listening to the podcast Man Has the Right. We'll continue after a short announcement.
This is Radio Liberty speaking.
24-hour live radio broadcast and audio library of the base programs and podcasts from Svoboda on the YouTube channel Radio Svoboda Live.
Radio Liberty is available on your computer monitor, on your mobile phone, and in your headphone.
The YouTube channel for Radio Liberty Live, your YouTube is acquiring a familiar voice.
You are listening to the podcast A Person Has the Right. It is hosted by me, Mariana Toracheshnikova.
And I am Natalia Jambaladova, and today we are discussing why, following the incident involving the attempted capture of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, everyone suddenly began to say that American President Donald Trump is infringing on the sacred principle of world order.
In what specific situations would an action against the head of state simply transform into an illegal kidnapping of a person, a blatant violation of all international standards?
When you operate on foreign territory without consent and without an international mandate, you apply force, secretly remove a person, you bypass extradition and judicial oversight. Then it transforms into that situation where you seize and take them away. And in legal terms, this is a combination of violation of sovereignty and arbitrary deprivation of liberty. There are many examples, in fact, of someone abducting another person without the consent of states. Even if we consider the early period after the Second World War, there were precedents, for instance, when Israel brought Eichmann from Argentina to their own court. And in this manner, for instance, they were undermining the sovereignty of Argentina, which was rightfully supposed to handle the situation with Eichmann on its own, given that he was residing within Argentina's borders. And as far as I recall, the Security Council condemned this kind of incident, and Israel subsequently paid reparations to Argentina. The question is, what if, for example, Venezuela now demands reparations from America for kidnapping a person from Venezuelan territory and taking them to America? They probably can. But the problem is that this will immediately run into the veto power that America has in the Security Council.
Well, all right, here's an example then. There is an international warrant out for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation. The International Criminal Court has issued a warrant for his arrest. And when Vladimir Putin would travel anywhere outside of Russia, he didn't travel very much. After that arrest warrant had been issued, everyone observed with keen interest what would Mongolia actually do and what would Azerbaijan do, countries that recognize the International Criminal Court, and yet they didn't touch Putin when he came to visit them. But if he had been arrested there, would that have been a scandal? And speaking more broadly, can a leader of a sovereign state for whom an arrest warrant has been issued be arrested anywhere in the world simply because that warrant exists?
The question is how effective the International Criminal Court's laws actually are. There was a legal juridical instrument known as the Rome Statute. This very document contains a contradiction. There is Article 98, which allows states to refer to law, customary law, in international relations. When I say customary law, in English, it's called... This is a right which is founded upon customs within the international order. What they are saying is that by virtue of customs in international politics, we acknowledge the immunity of heads of state from prosecution by other nations, unless such actions are sanctioned by the UN Security Council or there is no explicit consent from the country itself. And in this Article 98, it states that a nation can indeed invoke the principle of sovereignty, the principle of independence, and still choose not to detain the president of another country, even if there appears to be an arrest warrant issued against him. From the perspective of the Rome Statute, Mongolia, as a participant, should cooperate and fulfill the arrest request. However,
In practice, states sometimes shield themselves with arguments concerning immunity, and the political risk for Ulaanbaatar, it turned out, was far stronger than its legal obligation. So it seems we have a clear conflict between certain political considerations and the legal obligations that states willingly undertake. Unfortunately, political considerations very often prove to be more significant for those in positions of decision-making. And this is exactly the story that we are seeing unfold with Mongolia and with Putin.
If we were to develop this story further, could the president of some other nation, a country that considers itself the ultimate shaper of the global order, fly into Mongolia on his own helicopter and arrest Putin, stating, well, they are doing absolutely nothing, an international arrest warrant exists, so we will resolve this problem entirely on our own?
Here, Mongolia's own sovereignty would be violated if this were to happen. But even if we set all that aside, we still find that there's no UN Security Council mandate, no decision to use force for an arrest on the territory of a third state, and so on. If the state itself had undertaken obligations in accordance with the Rome Statute, then such an application of force, especially considering that they would be apprehending a dictator who has violated the rights of people, who has committed any form of genocide in one of its many manifestations, that's how it should be. As a citizen of the world, as someone who simply upholds human rights across the globe, I would certainly, of course, approve of such a step up to a certain point, especially if, for instance, all of this were to proceed through the International Criminal Court, and legal considerations were to take precedence over political considerations. So this is my personal moral conviction. But from the perspective, again, if such a thing were to be allowed, that one state is able to administer its own justice within the territory of another state, then this would very seriously undermine the very foundations of international order itself.
Dmitry, if we return to the situation with Maduro, many today are calling his capture an attack on international order and a violation of a head of state's personal immunity. In your opinion, what exactly was violated in this situation from a legal standpoint?
Sovereignty was violated, and the inviolability of heads of state was violated. Such a blatant act of contempt was carried out against international law, especially considering the entire context of what's happening now, as happening on the part of the Trump administration, when he withdraws from many international organizations, when he openly states that he supports such realism in the theory of international relations, where we place the interest of the state above all else, and we can do absolutely anything to achieve our own interests. We can view the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro as part of the course that the Trump administration is currently pursuing, and which openly undermines sovereignty, openly subverts the balance of power in international politics, leading to some division into strong, weak, and so on. And this all smacks of a world order that existed even before the League of Nations. There was such a concept of global governance called the Concert of Europe. Roughly speaking, it's when the emperors of Europe's main countries would gather at each other's homes and discuss how they could govern Europe, the world, the decisions of weaker states, and so on. What's happening now is a kind of rollback from the post-war system of international law, a retreat from neoliberal institutionalism in international relations to the level of I am strong and I want it this way. And if I am strong, then I have the power and the right to do it. The kidnapping of Maduro could also speak to some very significant shifts in how we perceive international politics.
And what international repercussions might this kidnapping situation have, particularly concerning Maduro? And if we look back a little, were there any significant consequences after Noriega's abduction in Panama? And more broadly, does the international community possess any effective means to dissuade powerful nations from acting in such a manner?
This could quickly turn into an international security crisis. There are risks of retaliatory operations, severed relations, sanctions, and military escalations. The main thing is the rule of inviolability for top officials is being undermined. Diplomacy could turn into a kind of leader hunt, so to speak. This sets a precedent for, an escalation of things in international security. At the UN, this will, of course, be a topic for a Security Council meeting, but real measures might not follow simply due to the American veto right. Within the very state that initiated such an abduction, disputes may arise over authority, over the control of force through parliamentary military powers. That is, we can talk at length about how democracy within America itself is undermined by such decisions to violate the sovereignty of other countries and use force against them without any internal discussion. As for Noriega, what were the consequences? This is quite interesting. As they say, the devil is in the details. Before America detained Noriega, he himself declared war on the United States. Before Panama's territory was seized and before they tried to remove him from the Holy See's nunciature, he took refuge in the Vatican embassy, and America couldn't get him out of that embassy by any means because it's an entirely different state. It is absolutely the sovereignty of the Holy See. America did not want to invade the embassy's territory because that would completely undermine the very foundations of diplomacy itself, though. No, therefore, American troops continuously played various rock music tracks without interruption. There's a meme that's quite prevalent now where people on the internet send one another Rick Astley's song, which is famously known as Never Gonna Give You Up. And when you send a meme like that to your friend, it's essentially your way of trying to pull a little prank on them. So they continuously broadcast these songs towards the embassy, creating a certain psychological pressure on the diplomatic mission. Then he emerged from there and, as it were, voluntarily surrendered to the Americans, who apprehended him as the leader of a state that was actively engaged in a state of war with America. Therefore, there are indeed many different details here that clearly distinguish the Panama case from the Maduro case. But in Noriega's case and in Maduro's case, there are many parallels. And both of these cases, they undermine international law.
On the other hand, this entire Maduro situation has really emboldened, I would even say unleashed, the voices of Russian propagandists. They were already saying before, oh, why is it that America can do this, but we can't? And now, even more so. That is to say, Putin justified his aggression against Ukraine by citing the necessity of protecting the civilian population there in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and also to protect the Russian-speaking population. And he stated that Ukraine was threatening the national security of the state. In other words, Russia, by attacking, is actually defending itself. And the entire world condemned Russia and sanctions were immediately imposed. But now when the United States of America openly violates the sovereignty of another sovereign nation and even abducts the leader of an independent state, there are absolutely no repercussions or sanctions from the international community. On the contrary, it seems as if everyone thinks, well, it's America. They are permitted to do this, but others are strictly forbidden.
How are we going to deal with this?
Here, we're seeing a logical technique at work, which in English is known as whataboutism. That is to say, what about? Or it's also sometimes presented as the logical fallacy of you too. In other words, instead of providing a substantive answer, the person shifts the discussion to others' wrongdoings. So, you criticize us, but look at yourselves or at someone else. The key mistake is simple. Even if another person broke the law, that doesn't make your action legal, and it doesn't answer the question of whether there was a violation now. Imagine if you were detained and tried in court for some murder, for example, and you say, why are you condemning me for murder?
But when, look, Petya from the other block, I don't know, he killed another person, but he wasn't prosecuted and no charges were filed against him and he's completely innocent.
If he is allowed to do it, then I am allowed to do it too. In the jurisprudence of internal courts within the framework of national law, such an argument simply does not work. This is a clear logical fallacy, and you cannot hide behind whataboutisms. International law, you see, it's founded on certain precedents. It's based on how each nation conducts itself. We document all of this, gradually modifying it, and over a significant period of time, it then becomes established as law in international politics. The problem is if this becomes the norm, if other countries also start kidnapping other presidents, if other countries start simply deflecting, saying America can, so why can't we? Then international law as such will erode and the format of international relations in the world will change very drastically. And I don't think that this will be a progressive development of events in any way. But when it comes to the specific use of this kind of thing in propaganda, it makes me feel very sad as just a person who has been following this situation for quite a long time, that leaders like Putin, Xi Jinping, and other figures who wish to violate international law now have such a precedent to escape accountability and criticism. This does not contribute to peace on earth in any way and only leads to the undermining of international law. But then again, if we look at all this with optimism, we can see that states condemn such violations of international law. Here, the sovereignty of nations remains intact. We don't have a situation where on a daily basis we hear about the sovereignty of one country being violated by another and so forth. This means we live in a world that is quite predictable, where we have established states, we understand how international borders function, and we understand that presidents won't be hunting each other down or taking them to their military bases. Cases like Maduro's, cases like Noriega's are still proving to be such an exception to the rules. And the fact that this is an exception, not a rule as such, here I think we need to add a little bit of optimism. For now, at this moment, I don't know how the situation with Greenland will develop. I don't know how the situation will develop further with other countries that Trump has targeted, but if we're being realistic, we still live in a world with a stable rule of national sovereignty and the inviolability of state leaders.
So from your point of view, is it still possible to say that international law is truly working today, or is it not?
It doesn't always work smoothly, it often works unfairly, but it truly does exist and is continuously utilized. This means we hear about some of its violations. The greater part of international life is functioning. In the sphere of power, it's evident that nations almost always try to justify their actions with some form of legal discourse. Even Trump, for instance, if you observe the rhetoric they employed to justify the abduction of Maduro, they still persist in justifying it through the language of international law. They still believe that yet there is some inherent way to this, that it is necessary to expend energy to justify and to uphold it, even in some way. In doing so, they invariably return to the support of international law. If law as a concept did not exist whatsoever, then no justifications would be required. The law, it does not abolish force, it makes force an expensive instrument of foreign policy. That's to say, there are political risks, some economic ones, and even those very same reputational risks, meaning when one state carries out the seizure of another state's territory, then in the world, this is very strongly condemned and not supported.
Nevertheless, lately we've been hearing more and more criticism directed at the official institutions of this international community, for example, the United Nations Security Council, which often fails to function because there are nations that hold veto power, and it is precisely these nations that most frequently violate aspects of the international order and subsequently prevent themselves from being held accountable or punished in any manner. It is said that these relations need to be reformed, but that also seems to be impossible, while several countries hold veto powers. From your point of view, is it truly possible to undertake actions to modify this system so that the international community can genuinely operate effectively in situations where serious, especially armed conflicts arise?
To be honest with you, I am not particularly fond of the proposed approach to solving this issue. On the one hand, experts frequently discuss the necessity of altering the composition of the permanent members within the United Nations organization. However, it seems to me that even if we were to add some members and remove others from this council, I seriously doubt that any other fundamental problems with this body would truly be resolved. If everyone among us is considered equal, but some are clearly more equal than others, then we will inevitably encounter the very same problems. Another situation is the rhetoric within this body, which is used when countries having no higher authority above them can constantly employ the very same argument about autism, allowing them to endlessly cycle away from the responsibility for their rhetoric, whereas ideally these countries sitting on the Security Council should be held accountable, negotiate with one another, and solve the problem of war in the world, which is absolutely not happening. So with some, I think some structural changes are necessary in the very way we perceive security in the world. Often, I cannot offer you a new body that would work instead of the UN Security Council. I propose to all my colleagues who are working in the field of political science to constantly, at any conference, at any meeting, simply raise this question and brainstorm, to discuss and explore what international governance could actually look like in the world.
Dmitry Zavialov, a doctor of political science, was our guest on the podcast A Person Has the Right. Mariana Torocheshnikova was your host.
And I'm Natalia Champalagova.